Hi guys. We're gonna have a case this week about somebody with atrial fibrillation. Historically, students struggle with the concept of atrial fibrillation, and frankly, I think if you're struggling, it's because you're overcomplicating the situation. So I'm going to give you the simple bird's eye view of atrial fibrillation and the main concepts to consider. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. You know that your heart is chopped into four main segments, right? So up here is your atria. So let's call this right atria, right ventricle, left ventricle. Okay, so we don't need to go through circulation, and one goes through the lungs and one goes through the body. Figure that out. So that's number one. Let's now though let's combine atria and ventricles together. So here is the atria, here is the ventricles. Let's combine them from the perspective of rhythm, the way your heart beats, because they beat the same. Your atria beat and then your ventricles beat. So lub dub, lub dub, lub dub. So when your atrium is beating, your ventricle is relaxing because it is pushing blood into or filling the ventricle, so it's full of blood for its next contraction. Okay, so easy. So we know that the impulse to contract are separated. So the atrium contract while or they're opposite. So the electrical conduction is separated by the AV node. The electrical conduction inside the heart is separated by the AV node, and only one impulse at a time can go through to the ventricles. So if you remember, you have your origin of your impulse occurs in your SA node of your atrium. You get an impulse that goes through the atrium at the same time, so the atrium contracts all at once. Beautiful. The lovely thing about the AV node is that in a healthy heart, impulses can't be sent anywhere else but through this AV node, and that does two things. One, it only allows one impulse in at one time. Lub, dub. So that dub is from one impulse that has been transferred through the AV node. Second, the AV node slows down the conduction, so there's a little bit of delay between lub and dub. Lub dub, because otherwise, if this electrical conduction was just was steamed through as fast as possible, the heart would kind of look like this. They would kind of contract almost at the same time with a very little lag. So the AV node creates a lag so that after lub, there's a little bit of delay to allow that that blood to enter into that center chamber and then beat. Lub dub, lub dub, lub dub. So there we go. There's the electrical conduction. What that also means inside of this is that these two parts of the heart are electrically independent. So whatever's happening up here electrically is separate from what's happening in there usually. And in a condition called atrial fibrillation, it means in the atrium, atrial, first word, atrium, there is dysfunction of the conduction, electrical impulses, so that you do not have one uniform lub. You do not have a uniform contraction of your atrium. The reason is you have impulses flying all over the place. They're disorganized. Sometimes they're in loops. Sometimes they're not. So the impulses have gone crazy, and we can talk about that at another time. But so there's impulses in there there's muscle cells stimulating their neighbor muscle cells, but it's not in a uniform fashion. So the beauty of that is atrial fibrillation can exist without causing ventricular fibrillation. And now ventricular fibrillation would be very bad because the ventricle is the lub dub, that this ventricle is the muscle that pushes blood out into your aorta and into your brain, muscles, legs, stomach, everywhere. So if you do not have a normal contraction or some sort of contraction inside your ventricle, you have no circulation. And I don't need to tell you what happens when no blood is circulating in your body. It's not a good day. So if people can develop arrhythmias inside their ventricle, inside their atrium, and that is called atrial fibrillation. It does not lead to ventricular fibrillation because of that AV node keeps things separate. So what are the consequences of atrial fibrillation when it happens? So the consequences are this. First off, I told you about the AV node. It only lets in one impulse at a time, but it's under healthy circumstances, only one impulse is hitting there because in a healthy atrium, there's one contraction at one time. Everything's being stimulated relatively at one time. And so this AV node is only receiving a stimulus 70 times per minute. That's your heart rate about. So this guy's only getting stimulated 70 times per minute because one impulse goes through the atrium and then it dies out. And then another one goes through and it dies out. That happens once a second. So that's normal. But remember the picture I just showed you where there's impulses all over the place. So in this case, this AV node might be getting an impulse just randomly sent to it or randomly stimulating the AV node maybe 100 times a minute or maybe 290 times per minute. I don't know. But this is one of the consequences of atrial fibrillation is a high heart rate. So heart rate, which should be 70 in a person with atrial fibrillation, that heart rate might be 100 or 150 or 200 because the AV node is being stimulated, can possibly being stimulated so frequently. So heart rate is one consequence of atrial fibrillation that needs to be addressed or at least monitored because, as you can imagine, if you have a high heart rate, if your heart is beating 200 times a minute at rest, one of the things that is going to do is decrease the amount of time that your ventricle has to fill with blood before it contracts. So normally fill with blood, contract, fill with blood, contract, fill with blood, contract. So those contractions are ejecting a good bit of blood into the aorta, into your body. If your ventricle is pumping that fast, and it's not associated with increased venous return, with exercise, with sympathetic nervous system flow to make sure that that you've got enough preload to push blood through at that speed, then what you could get is a reduced amount of blood in the ventricle for every contraction. And so what that means is you could get a reduced amount of blood pumped out to the body or a reduced amount of cardiac output. So this increased heart rate can lead to, in some cases, reduced cardiac output. So what is reduced cardiac output going to be? Well, I got less blood going to my brain. It's going to make me tired. I got less blood going to the muscles in my legs. It's going to make me short of breath when I'm walking up the stairs, or I'm going to have to take a rest when I walk up the stairs because not as much blood is able to reach to my legs when I'm walking around or doing. So fatigue, shortness of breath, can all be consequences of this issue of atrial fibrillation. If people, if atrial fibrillation is going on. The other part of atrial fibrillation is atrial fibrillation can spontaneously fix itself. In other words, you can just all of a sudden the atrium will fix that little random fibrillating circuit or chaos, and then all of a sudden be governed by the SA node again. So maybe for a while you'll be beating 70 beats per minute, and then you'll flip out into atrial fibrillation for some period of time. So some people can flip in and out of it. So sometimes they feel good, sometimes they feel not so good, or they can be in it all the time. And then the last thing about atrial fibrillation, just along this lines of heart rate, is that some people can be in atrial fibrillation and they don't even know it. So their heart rate isn't too high, or their ventricle can fill just fine without an atrial beat. So be aware that some people can live with atrial fibrillation, they don't even know it. Other people will be wildly short of breath, wildly fatigued. They'll feel it in their chest. So palpitations is another, but some people can feel their heart pumping so fast. So all of these things are things to consider, and atrial fibrillation can present in a number of different ways, but ultimately the same thing is going on inside of there. So what does that mean again? Well, that means that rate control, slowing the heart rate, is something that could potentially improve symptoms of people with atrial fibrillation. Okay, so next one. Here's the next one. So the other problem of atrial fibrillation is, besides symptoms and heart rate, is that if you do not have if your atrium is not clearing blood with every heartbeat, so rather than clearing blood, it's quivering. So blood is not being cleared completely from this atrium every second. Then that means there can be pooling of blood inside of this atrium. And pooling of blood inside of this atrium, pooling of blood anywhere is not a good thing, because stasis of blood is a risk factor for a clot. So pooling of blood is a definite risk of atrial fibrillation, and pooling can cause a clot to form inside the chamber of your atrium. So you don't feel that clot, so nobody even would know it's there. But one of the problems, one of the big risks of having a clot form inside of your atrium is that some of this clot could chip off into an embolus. And if it does, it will get out into the stream of blood flowing through, so it can flow into your ventricle. So you've got a little chunk of blood or a clot of blood in your ventricle. And so if it gets into your ventricle, it'll likely be pumped out. So here's this little guy being pumped out now into your bloodstream. Now the biggest risk for atrial fibrillation, of course, is that one of the early branches off of your aorta is your carotid artery. Anybody know where your carotid artery goes? It goes to your brain. So one of the risks is if this thing takes an early left turn, that means there is a clot traveling up the trunk of the tree that is supplying your brain with blood. And so as this thing gets into your brain and the branches of this artery start branching off, if you get a clot, eventually these vessels will get too small and the clot won't be able to float through the blood anymore. So it could wedge itself right at a spot where your I'm no good at drawing with this stuff, but it could wedge itself at a spot where your arteries are getting small. Those don't look small, but so this guy could wedge here, and because it's too big to fit through either of these right and left turns, and so that means you will have a absence of blood flowing through these vessels. Now, depending on, of course, where that is, if you got somebody's brain, and that's a bad brain, I get it. But if there's a blood vessel going through here and this clot happened to make it this far, well, that means you're going to have no blood flow to that part of your brain, and you're going to cause yourself a stroke. So that's no good. So atrial fibrillation, what does that mean? We're back to this problem, this little problem of atrial fibrillation, where the arrhythmia isn't something that is going to cause you a life-threatening problem. The arrhythmia part of it is going to cause you fatigue and a high heart rate, which do have to be handled. But it's the stroke that is the real risk for atrial fibrillation in terms of risk for life in the short term. So remember then, atrial fibrillation, heart rate is a big issue. Stroke prevention is a big issue. So these people have to be on, most of these people have to be on anticoagulants to prevent the formation of that clot inside the atrium. And that's what stroke prevention is in the context of atrial fibrillation. Symptoms, atrial fibrillation, and the last thing, risk factors, blood pressure control, cholesterol control, diabetes control, all those real key parts of this too. 1, 2, 3, atrial fibrillation, 1, 2, 3. Well, let's get going on this case. See ya.